my dears, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you as always. This is the series on my channel where we break down shows that involve disability and disabled narratives to prove that we've always been and always will be a part of the theater canon, work on our critical thinking media analysis skills, and talk about ways to maybe ethically stage these stories or at least ethically talk about them, all with the goal of lovingly pushing the industry in a more inclusive direction with a cool, that happened, now what? View of everything. Also, if you're new here, hi, I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I am an actor and disability dramaturg, among other things, with a specific research focus in accessible education, minority media analysis, and accessible theater. And also for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder-length curly hair that I've styled in a Christine Daae-esque way. I don't middle part usually, but I don't hate it. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Oh, and I'm wearing a blue dress. Also, if you like this series or any of my other stuff and want to support me, friendly reminder that the like and subscribe buttons are right there, as is the comment section. I also have a Patreon linked below if you're interested in that, but absolutely no pressure. I just know my target audience tends to struggle with object permanence, so I just remind you that those things exist. Today we're going to talk about The Phantom of the Opera because it's spooky month. This show in particular holds a very weird place in my heart, as it does for many people, because I grew up on it and I have a lot of nostalgia for it, but I also really dislike it. And that's something that I had a fascinating time unpacking over the course of this research process. For example, did you know that the show doesn't actually have a lot of really useless filler that makes no sense? It's just that my auditory processing is terrible and I never heard captions before? Wild. Anyway, Phantom is a mega musical that opened in the UK in 1986 by Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, with lyrics by Charles Hart with some additional by Richard Stilgoe, book by Webber and Stilgoe, and also is directed by Hal Prince, which is important because Prince's ability to turn ideas into grandiose concepts and shape stories of the creators in which he works with is frankly unmatched, and Phantom would not be Phantom without Hal Prince's work on this project. Now, Phantom was the longest running show in Broadway history and the second longest running musical in the West End, where it is currently still running. It was also the first show to use computerized automation. Now, for the very briefest history, Webber saw a campy musical adaptation of the show in the East End in 1984, which he then talked to his friend Cameron Mackintosh about, saying, maybe we could produce this production together or something, or do something with the IP in general, which became them watching the 1925 and 1943 films, deciding that this probably couldn't work on stage and giving up on the project. Then in 1985, Webber stumbled upon an old copy of the original book when he was in New York City, and he decided, why not sit down and give it a read? And then here we are. Months later, they premiered an unfinished first draft of the show for some friends at Sydmonton, which is his country house. And then after that, they released a pop single of the title song, which got to 7 on the UK charts. They later released All I Ask of You and got to 3 on the UK charts. And there was a lot of casting drama that I'm not gonna get into here. There's a BBC documentary about the making of Phantom that you can check out. But basically, they cast Sarah Brightman, Webber's wife at the time, as Christine, and that was a whole situation. And then they also auditioned and cast a new Phantom while having promised the role to somebody else and being quite far in contract negotiations with him, so that was also a whole thing. By the time they got to previews, literally everything was going wrong. There were so many different pieces to keep track of and make sure that they went right, and people often joked that the opera ghost was actually there and was actually haunting them. And the first 3 previews ended up canceled due to technical issues, but eventually it opened. It became a massive hit, it won the Olivier for Best Musical, and 2 years later in 1988 it moved to Broadway with Christine and Phantom reprising their roles. Ben Crawford also went on the first national tour of the show as Phantom after this, and they also won the Tony for Best Musical. In 2020, the West End production closed and was replaced with the scaled down tour version with significantly smaller running costs in July of 2021, and in April of 2023 it closed on Broadway after 35 years of being open. And there's a lot of rumors about some sort of immersive Phantom opening off Broadway maybe next year. Apparently a thinly veiled casting announcement went out that I don't remember coming across, but people say that it exists and it keeps coming up in there's articles about it existing, so I feel like maybe I just missed it. But rumors of Phantom coming back either with the cheaper running cost version like the West End has done, or that immersive production, or both of them existing sometime soon are rampant, and I'll believe it when I see it. There is a small piece of me that feels a little bit sad that I didn't live here at a time when Phantom was open. I feel like I missed a portion of history by just a few months. I also very heavily pondered going to London to see the show just for funsies, but ended up scrapping that idea because I don't like the show nearly enough to do that, but I will definitely add it to my itinerary if I'm ever in the UK for other reasons. And if my opinions on the show change after seeing it live, you will be the first to know about that. I don't think it will because I saw it live when I was 17, but you never know. I'm a different person now. Who knows? But anyway, let's talk about the plot. Also, if you don't know anything about the show, content warning for creepy male behavior and also murder. And also we're going to be going over spoilers, obviously, but also if you don't know what happens in the show at this point, good on you for managing to avoid it thus far. That takes serious skill. I'm quite proud of you. So the show opens with a prologue in 1919. Also, there's only a handful of spoken lines. It's sung through primarily. Where the Paris Opera House is auctioning off old things from the theater it no longer wants, including a monkey music box and a broken chandelier, and an old Raoul de Chagny is there bidding on many different things and being mournful about like the things that have been lost and like the past and whatever. The auctioneer mentions that the chandelier was involved in a mystery that was never explained around a supposed opera ghost, at which point the chandelier lights up and the overture begins and everybody gets chills because it's really cool, and the chandelier moves from the stage up onto the ceiling. It's kind of really iconic. Now we are in 1881, watching the cast of Hannibal rehearse with a woman named Carlotta as the prima donna, and it doesn't go fantastically. Also, they're distracted by the new managers of the opera house coming in to view said rehearsal, and then a backdrop falls and everybody scatters and they're screaming about the Phantom of the Opera, which the old owner tries to downplay a little bit and be like, oh, things just happen sometimes, don't worry about becoming the new managers of the opera house, I want to retire now. And the new managers are like, yeah, okay, this is totally fine. And then Carlotta throws a huge hissy fit about how these things happen way too often and they really should probably stop happening, and so she refuses to sing the role. Madame Giry, the ballet mistress and mother to Meg Giry, suggests Christine Daae, her daughter's best friend. They're both like chorus dancers together. And Christine is the orphaned child of a great Swedish violinist. They offer her up to sing the role, saying that she has been well taught. And Madame Giry says it in a very cryptic way, but that's also just how Madame Giry works. And since everybody's really down to the wire on this, they agree to it. Christine absolutely crushes the role and becomes beloved instantly. And also Raoul, the Vicomte de Chagny, recognizes her as they had been close friends when they were young, and he goes to her dressing room after the performance to try to reconnect with her. After the show, Meg is like, Christine, where did this come from? You were so amazing. And Christine's like, well, my father, when he was alive, told me about the angel of music and said that when he passed, he would send the angel of music from heaven to me, and I have been getting lessons from this angel, who I do not see. I only hear him. 0 red flags to be seen. I don't know what you're talking about. Raoul shows up and they're so excited to see each other and reconnect, and she's like, oh, he was there when my dad told me the stories about the angel of music. He's gonna get it. So she tells him about it and he's like, wow, your imagination is just so lovely. Would you like to go out to dinner together? And then he leaves to go get his hat. But in the meantime, while he's gone, she hears the Phantom, who's kind of jealous that now she likes another boy. And he sings to her and she tells him to reveal himself, which he does behind her mirror. This reveal live, if you don't know that it's coming, is also absolutely iconic. There is no theater trick that is more fun to me than people appearing in things that are reflective or matte and then become transparent. There's so many of them in Tommy, and it was delightful to me every single time. Anyway, so he appears and basically hypnotizes her and takes her through the mirror down to the stairs beneath the opera house, and he puts her on a boat and he brings her to his lair across the lake. This is the title song of the show. You probably have seen this image before. Also, the majority of the song, in case you didn't know, is not sung live because logistically with the blocking it's near impossible to do so, and there's body doubles for a solid portion of it, which they did a really bad job of hiding when they filmed the Royal Albert Hall version, which is really, really funny. But anyway, so in his lair, he tells her that he's written music for her, and it's kind of sensual and weird between the two of them, and then she passes out, and then he gently tucks her into bed and he sings to himself and continues working on composing things at his organ that he has in his lair. How did the organ get there? Great question. Don't have answers for you. She awakens to the sound of a monkey music box. Not to the sound of the organ, the sound of a very quiet little monkey music box. Also, full circle to the music box from earlier. What does this symbolize? Is she the monkey being wound up by the Phantom to do his bidding? I don't know. Alternatively, was the Phantom the monkey performing when he was younger and now he's broken out and keeps it as a reminder of what he was and he will never be again? Did they decide to have a monkey in an astrakhan cap as a nod to the Persian, who was a crucial piece of the Phantom puzzle in the original book and is described by that hat and by that hat alone effectively, but then just completely cut from this version? We may never know. Anyway, so she walks up to the Phantom and she takes off his mask and she's horrified by what his face looks like, which this is deliberately not revealed to the audience in this moment to build up some semblance of suspense as to what his face looks like, so that the later reveal of it, where the prosthetics really can only be fully seen by the first handful of rows, will have a more shocking effect in Act 2. Something deliberate freak show disability narrative yada yada. He yells at her for having taken off the mask, but then turns the anger into sadness and a "you should pity me, I've never been loved before" situation that maybe isn't great. But then she feels bad, and so she gives him back the mask, and then he brings her back upstairs to her dressing room. While this is happening, we see Joseph Bouquet telling the chorus girls about what the Phantom looks like because he claims that he's seen him, and Madame Giry tells him not to speak of things in which he does not know and to kind of restrain himself in probably the most cryptic way humanly possible, but again, that is her vibe. We then see the new managers in their office being angry about lots of notes that they've received from the Phantom, then joined by Raoul and Carlotta, who are also angry about notes that they've received from the Phantom, which are very sassy, very matter of fact, and like, you're gonna do this thing or else, which includes him extorting the managers for a godforsaken amount of money, requiring that Box 5 remains open for his personal use, and demanding that Christine lead the next opera and Carlotta play the page boy who doesn't have any lines because she's bad at her job. The managers are like, no, Carlotta, you're the best and you're perfect and we're gonna keep you here because we want you to sing the opera and we love you, and screw the ghost, it's totally fine, he's not even a real thing anyway. So the opera's sung, and things seem to be going well until Carlotta can suddenly only croak like a toad and is embarrassed and horrified while the Phantom is laughing, and then Christine is quickly forced to take over the role. And as she runs off to get changed into the new costume, they do one of the ballets from later in the show to keep the audience entertained, and Bouquet's hanging corpse drops from the rafters, and chaos ensues. During the chaos, Christine and Raoul run off, and she tells him about being kidnapped by the Phantom, and while he still doesn't completely believe her, he loves her and he will protect her no matter what. And the Phantom overhears this because my guy has ears everywhere and he's very sad about it, but then he becomes really angry about it because that's a great way to deal with your emotions, and he declares that he's going to take revenge on her. And during the curtain call, the chandelier crashes down onto the stage. Great, intermission. Also, if you want to know more about the making of the chandelier and how it works, Wait in the Wings has an incredible mini documentary on it that I will link in the description below for you because you should check it out. Act 2. It is 6 months after the chandelier accident, and we are at a masquerade ball at the opera where everybody is celebrating the fact that the Phantom has not been around for 6 full months. Also, Christine and Raoul are engaged. Also, this song, Masquerade, has the most confusing and hard to keep track of lyrics of any song I've literally ever seen in my entire life, and I have great appreciation for anybody who has ever had to learn it. I see you, and I'm sorry. Anyway, so the Phantom appears at the party dressed as the Red Death to tell everybody that he has written a Don Juan opera, and it will be produced by the opera, and Christine will play the leading role. And then he disappears in a literal puff of smoke, because he's nothing if not dramatic. Raoul is reasonably quite angry at this because obviously Christine has got a lot of PTSD from this situation, and he was hoping she was getting better, and now he's back, and he suspects that Madame Giry knows what's up because she's cryptic as heck, and so he interrogates her about the man, and she quickly explains that he was born with a facial difference, and he'd grown up in freak shows, he'd been locked in a cage despite being a talented architect, composer, and magician, and he eventually escaped the freak show and now lives beneath the opera house, which she knows because she saw him in the cage. And she describes him as a freak of nature, more monster than man. Raoul decides that the premiere of Phantom's opera would actually be a really great time to set a trap for the Phantom and capture him once and for all. Christine is very scared by everything, obviously, reasonably, and she repeatedly refuses to do the opera, but he ends up convincing her to do it so that they can set this trap and be free of the Phantom forever. More chaos happens in rehearsal for this opera. Great. Then Christine goes to her father's grave and she's like, oh, I wish I had some guidance from you on what to do. Everything's just kind of really bad right now. And the Phantom appears and he sings to her while she's clearly in a very vulnerable state, and so she is once again hypnotized by him. But then Raoul arrives and pulls her away and has to dodge fireballs while doing so, because at this point the Phantom decides to declare war on the both of them. If you at this point are going, why does everybody talk about the Phantom like he's some sort of magical, wonderful sex god? He's the worst. Thank you, I agree. The opera begins, things seem to be going well, until she realizes that the Phantom has replaced the leading tenor in the opera, and she's like, this can't be good, and then rips off his mask in front of everybody. And in absolute horror, he grabs her and drags her back down to his lair, and in the chaos, the body of the original tenor, also strangled by a rope, is found. Mayhem ensues, and an angry mob decides to track down the Phantom to avenge the murders. Raoul finds Madame Giry and is like, you know where he is, get me to Christine, and she agrees to help, and they go to search for his lair. And there's a moment where Madame Giry is like, keep your hand at the level of your eyes so that if the noose like comes over, you can just like slip out of it. And they're both like, okay, hand in front of your eyes, and then they both immediately drop their hands by their sides. It's the funniest thing. I don't know why no director was like, hey, so maybe that's a problem. But very funny. Meanwhile, in the lair, we see that Christine has been forced into a wedding dress by the Phantom, which logistically I have a lot of questions, but that's beside the point, and she's panicking. Reasonably. Raoul comes in to try to save her, I don't know where Madame Giry went, whatever, and ends up in a noose that the Phantom threatens to use if she does not agree to marry him. In a bind, she agrees, and she tells the Phantom, this haunted face holds no horror for me now, it's in your soul that the true distortion lies. And then she calls him a pitiful creature, and she's sad that he's never known love or compassion, and so she pity kisses him, letting him know that he's not alone. And this kiss completely breaks him as a person, and he's like, okay, go away, both of you, don't tell anybody about any of this. And then the two of them run off, but then Christine comes back for a moment, and the Phantom tells her that he loves her, and she kisses his hand, and then she leaves for the final time. As we hear the mob get closer, he hides under his cloak in his chair, and Meg appears first, and she goes to remove the cloak from the chair, only to find just his mask, which she picks up, and the spotlight focuses on the mask, and then the lights fade, and the end. That's the musical that we have to work with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, The Phantom of the Opera is based on a book titled Le Fantôme de l'Opéra by Gaston Leroux, first published as a serial in 1909 and 1910, and then as a book, and it was first published in English in 1911. Leroux was a journalist and later in life began writing fictional mystery novels, becoming particularly famous for The Mystery of the Yellow Room and The Perfume of the Lady in Black, published in 1907 and 1908, respectively. Most sources say that Phantom wasn't super successful initially and only really gained popularity after people started adapting it, but it seems more likely that it was successful as a serial, and then few people purchased the book when published because they'd already read it in newspapers, so it was a part of the cultural consciousness, even if the book itself wasn't the most technically popular thing in the world. He also based many pieces of this on real things, such as the fact that there is a real, well, it's technically a cistern, it's not a lake, but lake underneath the Palais Garnier, as well as many different rumors and legends of ghosts living there. One of which may or may not be a legend about a piano-playing ghost without a face, but mentions of this legend only appear in relation to Phantom history in a way that I can't find sourced anywhere else, and there's been a lot of revisionist history as to what was or was not true in this story, so I personally don't think that that legend actually existed before the publication of this book. But one thing that is very true and very sourced, however, is that in May of 1896, a counterweight to the chandelier fell through the ceiling and into the crowd in the middle of an opera at the Palais Garnier, killing a concierge. So he thought, well, what if it was a real chandelier and also on purpose? That would be a fun piece of a story, and so that's where we got Phantom from. Now, if you've been here for a while, you know that I've read a few old books for this series, always by audiobooks so that I can get through them, and oftentimes they're not very good. Books from this era tend to be sloggy and also absolutely all over the place because I am quite convinced book editors were not a concept at this time in history, which makes me so happy to report that I really enjoyed this book and I will probably be reading it again. It's written like a true crime investigative journalist report where Leroux was a narrator talking the reader through his quest to solve the mystery of what had happened at the opera house, which makes each piece build on each other quite nicely, and it also gives you insight into the headspaces of several different characters. Most notably, you realize that Raoul is the only reasonably behaving person in this entire story, and they did him real dirty in the musical. But it plays in suspense really well, and while it sometimes did feel a little bit wordy in the way that things were at the time, you don't really majorly notice it because the story itself is very intriguing and moves quite quickly. I was very pleasantly surprised. Oh, before I get into the plot, quick sidebar for me to show you the paint by number that I started during Hunchback and have finally finished when I was making this video. Hold up. Okay, here we go. Is it on screen? There it is. For friends who can't see it, it's a little beach house with sailboats, and it's really cute, and I have absolutely nowhere on my wall to put it because I've made way too many of these at this point. But yes, I made this. I did a good job. It was a fun time. Thank you to Phantom for entertaining me while I finished that. So the book opens by giving us some background on what Leroux is investigating, the opera ghost who is supposedly haunting the Palais Garnier and killed a man named Joseph Bouquet who claimed to have seen him. We learn that the Phantom left notes in red ink with a clumsy childish hand, and overall the plot is very, very similar to that of the musical. It's a fairly faithful adaptation. It's just they're from different points of view. So most of this book kind of centers Raoul and other people's viewings of what is happening rather than being from the Phantom or Christine's point of view. Which I think is interesting and gives a completely different angle as to what is going on. Some pieces of the book that are not in the musical are the fact that the Phantom tells Christine that if she marries, he will leave her. Also, it is written in such a way that makes the reader go, oh, she's being actively groomed by the Phantom and Raoul's trying to get her out, but he can't. Raoul at first doesn't believe the Phantom is real, but then he comes upon Christine and the Phantom at her father's grave and ends up getting slightly screwed over by the ghost, and so then he totally, completely believes in him pretty early on. Also, the Phantom sleeps in a coffin, normal behavior. He has like a full house situation on the banks of the underwater lake. It's not just like a random lair. And when he first kidnaps her, after Carlotta sings like a toad and the chandelier falls, he takes her to his place and he lets her sleep. He leaves her a note that he's like off to buy her the things that she needs or whatever. He only intends to keep her there for a very short while and let her go, but she takes off his mask and he gets all angry and basically says that now that she's seen his ugly face, he knows that she'll never return to him again, so now he has to keep her hostage forever, and she feels really bad for him. But after 2 weeks, she asks him to release her, and he agrees as long as she wears his ring and stays faithful to him. Also, we learn that his name is Eric, with a K. that's important. Eric with a C just is a different connotation in my brain. After she leaves, she goes and tells Raoul, and he makes this whole plan to get her out of there, but she's like, no, I need to sing for him one more time before I escape. Also, silly geese behavior. Don't plan your escape from a creepy man who's everywhere all of the time in the building in which the creepy man lives. That's not gonna go very well for you. What are you doing? Anyway, during the final opera that she is to sing, the lights briefly go out and she falls through a trapdoor, taken away by the Phantom, and everybody's freaking out and trying to figure out where she might be because she had literally just disappeared, which is hilarious and iconic and creates so much confusion. And I really wish that that were in literally any of the other adaptations, because that's way more fun than whatever the ending is in most other adaptations. Here's where we meet the Persian, who is only described as such, and he narrates a huge chunk of this book. And he's like, Raoul, I know where she's been taken. Come with me, and tells him to keep his hand at the height of his eyes, because Eric is very good with what is called the Punjab lasso, which is a specific kind of noose that he uses to strangle people, and if you have your hand in the way, you can slip out of that. I explained that earlier, and I explained it a second time. Great. While they're trying to find Christine in the bowels of the opera house, Eric is trying to force her to marry him. And the Persian and Raoul get trapped in a mirrored torture room built by Eric and nearly die, and that's a whole thing. Also, they realize that the Phantom has filled the basement of the opera house with gunpowder, and in giving her the choice to marry him or not marry him, she has to turn one of two things, and they're both wired up to trigger different reactions. So if she turns the yes, I will marry you thing, the entire basement will fill with water, which will ruin all of the explosives. And if she turns the no thing, it will blow up everything and everybody. And he made it with enough explosives to blow up not just the currently full of people opera house, but also a massive radius beyond that. She turns the yes, marry thing and releases the water that then almost drowns Raoul and the Persian in the torture chamber. But she promises to the Phantom, hey, if you release the two of them, I promise you that after I marry you, I won't immediately kill myself. And he's like, oh my gosh, she's so perfect. And so he lets them go. And then he takes off his mask to kiss her on the forehead, and she kisses him back, and he's like, wow, I've never kissed literally anybody before. And then they both cry, and then she feels really bad for him, and so then he lets her go free, and within a few weeks dies of heartbreak, and she returns to give him his ring back and help to bury him as she had promised. And then Christine and Raoul run away together, never to be heard from again. We learn in the epilogue that Eric was born disabled and ran away from home at an early age because he was neither loved nor cared for, and then he spent years traveling Europe in fairs where he was exhibited as the living corpse and learned magic and artistry, and then he became an architect building trick palaces with trapdoors and hidden lairs in Persia and in Turkey, which is where he met the Persian. He also worked as an assassin for some time, which is why he's so good with the Punjab lasso, and his ability to lurk and hide and overhear and throw his voice are all from his circus training. And as an architect, he was hired to work as a contractor on the Palais Garnier, where he made a lair for himself, along with secret passages and whatnot. Also, Madame Giry is just a box attendant who attends to box 5 and has therefore interacted with the ghost many times before. And the musical decided to sort of combine Madame Giry and the Persian into the same role. I forgot to mention that. The Persian doesn't really appear in most of the adaptations. Lindsay Ellis has a video about that. I'm going to talk about Lindsay Ellis quite a few times throughout this because she's got a lot of stuff on Phantom, but the Persian really only appears in the 1925 film and then kind of disappears for the rest of forever after that. But that's the book. Overall, again, good time. It gives all the characters more depth in the sense of their lives and their stories than the musical does, because the musical focuses more on the emotional depth of the people we meet rather than like who are they as people. So I would recommend it if you are interested, especially if you love this story, and also especially if you like mysteries but don't really like spooky stuff, because this book is not that spooky at all, but it is a good mystery. But now it's time to play our favorite game, which is of course Adaptation Bingo. This book has actually a gazillion adaptations, so I narrowed it down significantly to versions that I know directly inspired pieces of the musical and ones that very much shaped wider cultural understandings of the story, so probably also inspired pieces of the musical. And also that one weird one from the 1970s that very few people saw and definitely didn't inspire anything, but Lindsay Ellis recommended it in like 3 different videos and I had extra time, so I figured why not watch it. Boy, was I not disappointed. We're gonna get to that one. Our first adaptation, which is technically the second because there was a 1916 German silent film adaptation that is now lost, as many of the earliest silent films are, is the 1925 silent film, which I really enjoyed and also would recommend. This version is free online if you want to watch it, so like not only am I recommending it, but it's free. Often silent films are kind of hard to follow because all the characters look the same, but they did a really good job of introducing these ones very clearly and delineating them super clearly, which I quite liked. Also, Lon Chaney Kenny, who you may remember as the original Quasimodo, also his parents were deaf, which I think is very cool. He's a very cool guy, plays the Phantom. In this version, he has a full face cloth mask, and once underneath the mask is revealed, looks like a living skull. This version follows the book really, really closely, with the exception of the last 5 minutes of the film that became a carriage chase of sorts, which is sort of reminiscent of a brief moment in the book where the Phantom is driving a carriage that Christine is in, followed by an angry mob throwing him into the lake at the end. They also added a moment with a note that says, Eric, born during the Boulevard Massacre, self-educated musician and master of black art, exiled to Devil's Island for criminal insane, escaped, now at large. Which I don't really have feelings about in either direction, but I do think that the idea that he was caught and is on the run, rather than him just moving his way from place to place mysteriously, might kill the vibe a little bit, in my opinion. I don't know. The other thing that I want to note is that the majority of the costumes in this version are very close to the descriptions in the book, which can be interpreted in several different ways, and it's very clear that Weber's costume designer, Maria Bjornsson, was inspired by the visuals in this film, which I think is really fun to see that legacy happen. The next adaptation is the 1943 film. This one is fun because it's a Hays Code adaptation. If you're into the world of film history, the Hays Code was a set of censorship rules in place for all motion pictures that came out from 1934 to 1968. I have a video about it up here that I will link. And the Hays Code basically forced these films to all conform to strict moral rules so as to make sure that the people who watch these films don't get morally corrupted, because we can't have that. Hays Code adaptations of things are fun because they usually feel like the intellectual property has gone through a blender, and then watching them becomes like a scavenger hunt for the original plot. Even though half of the changes made are always ones that I'm like, I don't know what that has to do with the Hays Code, so why was this choice made? And we'll never know. This version has a lot of, you can't be an opera singer and a normal girl at the same time, you must choose. Also, her name is Christine Dubois for some reason. Daye is not that hard to pronounce. And she has a voice teacher whose name is Anatole, who she is in love with. And also there's a guy named Inspector Daubert. And they both fulfill the Raoul character, but it's kind of a choice between like the arts and a normal life, sort of. And then also there's Eric Claudin, a violinist at the opera and composer who's kind of obsessed with her and got fired from being a violinist because he was struggling with his left hand. And so for money, he goes to sell his compositions for publication, and the dude running the publication company pretends to have lost the work or whatever, but then he actually pitches the work to Liszt, yes, that Liszt, for it to be published under his name instead to make him more money. And Claudin catches them in the act and gets very angry, and then he strangles somebody to death, and then somebody else splashes acid in his face, and then he becomes disfigured, and he runs off to jump into the nearest body of water, which somehow connects to him finding the underneath of the opera house, where he then lives and wreaks havoc. His mask is also a full face mask, but it's more like shaped as he took it from the costume room, so all of his phantom shenanigans happen over a very short period of time while they're actively trying to track down Claudin, the murderer. So everybody effectively knows who the opera ghost is, and I think that kind of kills a bit of the fun mystery of it all. But anyway, he dies at the end, as is to be expected. And you may be wondering, how could she pick Raoul if there are two Raouls? To which I'm so happy to report that the two of them fight over her, and then she walks out to be among the rest of her admirers, and the two of them decide to go out to dinner together instead, with a deliberate elongated eye contact after that agreement is made that holds a lot of subtext that isn't technically allowed by the Hays Code, but is ambiguous enough queer coding that they couldn't directly get in trouble for it. And the fact that the gayest version of Phantom is the first film made under the Hays Code is hilarious to me, because there are so many options for queerness in the story. Anyway, I also want to note that apparently they wanted to make the Phantom Scars a full face situation and a lot more like grotesque than what they ended up doing in this film, but they realized that many men were coming home from the war with facial scarring and thought it in poor taste, so they decided to do something lighter with it instead. Next, we have the 1962 film, one that I can only describe as the Hays Code version being put through the Hays Code a second time. Her name is Christine Charles. Raoul's name is Harry Hunter. What happened here? There's a guy whose name is Lord Ambrose, and he works at the opera house and gives them music to play that supposedly he composed but actually stole it from a Professor Petrie, who used to teach singing at the academy and was always a little bit of a kooky wallflower, and supposedly died tragically in a fire when he was at the printers trying to get his music published. But actually, you see, what happened was he went there to get his stuff printed, and it was stolen in a very similar way to the 1943 version. But this time he watched it being printed with Ambrose's name on it. So then he broke in after hours and tried to burn all of it, but accidentally started a fire, and then he tried to put it out with the first liquid that he saw, which happened to be nitric acid. And so then he got burned, and then he jumped into the water and ended up at the opera house, and again, a way that is really unclear. Also, he has an accomplice who doesn't speak and just helps him with things. So that's bizarre. There's a lot of stronger feminist messaging in this one, in that like Lord Ambrose promises Christine a nicer role if she sleeps with him, but she refuses and then she gets fired. Also, the Act 2 opera is not Don Juan, but Joan of Arc, and the chandelier nearly falls on her at the end, but the Phantom rips off his mask and he jumps from box 5 and he pushes her out of the way, and then he gets killed and squashed by the chandelier instead. But yeah, this one is a lot less cohesive than the 1943 version, which is saying something. Next, we have the 1974 film Phantom of the Paradise. This definitely did not inspire any portion of anything at all whatsoever anywhere, but again, if Lindsay Ellis keeps telling you to watch something, you watch the thing, and boy am I glad that I did. I'm gonna keep my summary of this adaptation very minimal because I very much encourage you to go experience it on your own. You can rent it on Amazon. Basically, this is a low-budget horror film in the style of Rocky Horror, directed by Brian De Palma, that somehow manages to combine Phantom, not the original Phantom, 1962 Phantom, with Picture of Dorian Gray and also Faust, and also is in the 1970s at a record label, to create an experience that I can only describe as drugs. And it has some crazy reveals as the film goes on in a way that you realize there was definitely foreshadowing for that, but you just assumed the foreshadowing was just mistakes, and now they're like, oh, this is a poorly edited and poorly made film. And so then you start realizing that it was actually smart, and you're like angry that it was that smart. Also, the Carlotta character is a very gay man with a slight lisp, and his name is Beef. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Go watch it with your friends. The screams that we scrumped as this film managed to get more baffling over time were truly delightful, and I really wish I could see it for the first time again. So if you take anything away from this video, it needs to be go watch Phantom of the Paradise, and then report back to me what you think, because I wanted to be able to talk to more people about this movie. After this is the musical, which obviously we have been talking about and will continue to talk about. I compared 3 different versions of the show: the original West End production, the 2011 Royal Albert Hall 25th Anniversary Pro Shot production, and then the 2014 Broadway production with Sierra Boggess and Norm Lewis. And I did this mostly to compare how different Phantoms perform the role, because obviously staging across the board, while it changes slightly for different venues, is effectively the same. And this is when I discovered that the actor playing Phantom has approximately 0 wiggle room with this character. There are moments where different Phantoms are more angry or less angry than others. There's moments when they're more sad or less sad than others. But otherwise, the score and blocking and staging completely lock the actor into playing the character in the same precise way. And you may be thinking, well, they're all replacements of the same role and it's the same staging, so that's probably why. But like, I've been researching Wicked for years, and I've seen probably over 10 Elphabas at this point, and every single one of them has noticeable differences in character development despite them technically being streamlined. So that's not the cause. And there is narrative reason for this, which we'll get into later, but I was planning this whole like comparing how different Phantoms portray disability piece to this video that I simply cannot do, which I think is very interesting. I do very much feel like Sierra Boggess and Rabin Karimloo are the Christine and Phantom of all time, and Royal Albert Hall is the best version of Phantom, objectively, other than seeing it live, I would assume. But I think seeing it live would evenly rival with the Royal Albert Hall version. It's so well filmed, and the scale is so grand, and also you can watch it with captions, so you actually know what's going on, and also the chandelier is really cool. But that then brings us to the version that I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, which is the 2004 movie version of the musical directed by Joel Schumacher, which can be best described as being as successful with the nuances of the Phantom storytelling as Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd was. Though both films did work with the original composers in making changes to the original script, which says, once again, a lot about the skill and talent that Hal Prince had with storytelling. This film is largely clowned on for various reasons. I'm not going to dunk on it further. Lindsay Ellis has a great video essay about it if you're bored. But it overall comes down to it clearly being a big budget movie, but the fact that said budget did not go toward sound mixing or seemingly recording the songs more than one time or toward editing the film, which was all over the place, which is just quite interesting. Also, his facial difference is not that noticeable because they wanted him to be a sexier Phantom, which was bizarre, and they used mirror imagery unsuccessfully, and there's a sword fight between the Phantom and Raoul in a graveyard, and a lot of things are spoken instead of sung, but it's still the lines from the songs, so they're just speaking it in perfect rhyme out of nowhere, which is very terrible and very off-putting and weird. And they sexualize Christine a lot more, both in blocking and in costuming, which is really extra unsettling when you realize that Emily Rossum was about 17 years old when this movie was filmed. That's a child. Stop it. My one positive review would be that Minnie Driver is a treasure. But overall, this film really suffered from the issues we often talk about with movie musicals today, where it's clearly somewhat embarrassed to be a movie musical and was somewhere caught between whether it wanted to utilize the new things allotted by the medium of film and adapt it to like make the story fit this new artistic medium, or if they wanted to just replicate the musical, which meant that it kind of succeeded in neither thing. I also, unfortunately, should mention Love Never Dies before we move on. I will be brief because, oh no. Love Never Dies is the sequel to Phantom, which he began writing in 1990, shortly after divorcing Sarah Brightman, which explains a lot of the she chose the other man, but I think he sucks, and actually the right thing to do is to go back to the Phantom and say she truly loves him and they end up together aspects of the plot. And it opened in 2010 in the West End, and it ran for nearly a year and a half, but had overall mixed reviews, and then it was planning to transfer to Broadway, which then got postponed and then got cancelled, followed by a run in Australia, which they revamped and rewrote giant, massive amounts of, and then they did a pro shot of that, so you can watch that if you want, but it is nicknamed Paint Never Dries for a reason, so take that into account. Also, it does do the sequel thing, where all of the character development from the original film gets completely wiped away and you start back at square one, which is infuriating. And also it takes place technically 10 years after the original, but historically is 26 years after the original, which isn't actually even a large critique of the piece itself. That's just a very small nitpick. Also, it uses a lot of deliberate freak show imagery, which doesn't make a lot of sense because why would Phantom go to a freak show? And also, why didn't he die after the first one? Because that's definitely what happened. Everybody has a lot of questions about Love Never Dies. I'm not alone in having these many questions about Love Never Dies, and seeing the national tour of it is something that I will literally never forget. It is an absolute core memory. I spent hours the following day trying to track down reviews of this thing to make sure I wasn't actually losing my mind about the show that I had just seen. So for the sake of analysis, I have made the executive decision to pretend that Love Never Dies is not a real thing that happened, and that Phantom is a standalone piece. And honestly, I think the majority of Phantom fans have also made that decision, so I'm not alone in that. Most of the narrative things that we are going to talk about with the show are still present in the sequel anyway, so it's not like there's much to add, nor does it actually give us more clues about Eric as a character, because that story and character arc was in approximately 0 people's minds when they were making the first one, so it doesn't really impact anything anyway. Now, normally this is the place where we would start talking about disability narratives, but if you'll give me just a moment to talk about 2 things that really bother me about the show outside the disability realm that I think are just worth discussing more generally, and then we'll get into it. The first thing is that it's creepy, and not in like a, ooh, spooky horror musical way, creepy way. I mean, like, why are we pretending that the relationship between Christine and the Phantom is anything other than grooming and stalking, and spooky basement organ man should not be portrayed as some weird sex idol? This comparison will inevitably come up later in this video, but I very much see shows through the lens of where they sit in disability history, and all I could think of is Hunchback, and how narratively the two are very similar, just with different elements of Quasimodo split between Raoul and the Phantom, with, of course, the Phantom primarily being Frollo. And I'm sorry, but if you come out of Hunchback going, wow, the way Frollo treated Esmeralda was really hot, I'm concerned for you. I just kept thinking over and over again about the ContraPoints Twilight video throughout watching all these interviews of people talking about how sexy the Phantom is, and I was just like, I think that it's cool that we have a sexy and sexualized disabled character, because disabled people are usually portrayed as completely sexless beings when that's just not the case. But I also feel a little weird praising them for doing that when the relationship looks like this. It reads like fan fiction, and it effectively is fan fiction of the original text, which I'm not conceptually opposed to. Like, Wicked is also technically fan fiction of The Wizard of Oz, but Wicked doesn't try to narratively defend being a serial killer, so it doesn't feel like a super comparable situation. Anyway, I don't know what kind of damage may have been caused to a generation of young girls hearing everybody talk about how romantic and beautiful and attractive the Phantom is in his controllingness and terribleness, but it can't have been good. It does depend on the Phantom a little bit, like sometimes the age gap is large enough that he could be her father, which is just a hard note for me, and sometimes they're a lot closer in age, which I hate a little bit less. But either way, this part of the show has rapidly aged itself very quickly, and it makes me viscerally uncomfortable, and frankly it did from the beginning, and I think that it is increasingly off-putting to audiences. There never should have been a love triangle. I think frankly the idea of the Phantom just wanting somebody to notice him for his genius and using marriage as a way to force her to stay with him rather than having any actual romantic attraction to Christine is narratively a lot stronger for his character. Like, spurned lover versus person longing for literally any human connection are 2 very different things, and I think the second interpretation serves the story better. And also, I must once again remind you that Christine is only maybe 20 years old. The Phantom is estimated to be around 25 to 30 years older than that, so ew. I do think that there is interesting discussion to be had about the issues with incel language and behavior within the disabled community and with grooming within the disabled community. This idea that the fact that society sidelines disabled men is actually because it's women's fault and women owe men attention and whatnot, particularly disabled women. Like, I know that this rhetoric is very popular in some subsections of the community, and I've talked about it in regards to the autistic community on this channel before, but I also think that's a conversation that should definitely be led by disabled people and also should not be handled in the way that Phantom handles it. The other thing that bothers me about this show is that it really relies on the harmful tortured artist trope. This is another thing that I have a video on that I will link above, but as a super short summary, we have this idea that in order to be a great artist, you must go through terrible things, and from these things you make your art. And we glorify these people who suffered and say, this is the reason we got, you know, Nirvana and Van Gogh's Starry Night and Sylvia Plath's and Edgar Allan Poe's great works. And this is an issue for a few reasons. The main one being, hey, let's not glorify human suffering so we feel better about it existing. And also, that artists make art. They make art regardless of what's going on. And artists who are not miserable will actually be better at their craft. They will be more focused on their craft. They will live longer to make more art, and they will better develop a healthy work-life balance between themselves and their art. We also know that this idea makes people, especially artists, hesitant to get the help and support that they need because they fear that it will curb their creativity. It's also often used to defend artists who actively abuse people, particularly male artists like Picasso, for example. And our arts education system in particular is so in love with this concept that it bakes it into everything that we do in curriculum, justifying traumatizing students in the name of learning and perfecting a craft, even when we have so much data around the fact that that is not how learning actually works in the brain and actively inhibits learning. And also, humans will be much less likely to burn out if we treat them like human people who deserve to have pain and suffering minimized as much as possible at all times. This is where a lot of my work on creating accessible curricula centers. And I'm not going to bring you on that tangent, but all of which is to say is that abuse, both towards other people and towards ourselves, is culturally expected of and rewarded in artists because of this idea of the adult genius, when technically, maybe there's actually no justification for abuse and it shouldn't be happening. But you see, the Phantom, especially Weber's Phantom, is so talented because of everything he's been through. This beautifully tragic soul who's almost admirable because he would do anything for his art, even if that involves kidnapping a young girl and killing a lot of people, which in my opinion, no opera or piece of art is ever good enough to justify that behavior. Not to mention that his opera isn't even that good, but that might just be me. But I have very little patience for this trope because it is the number one thing that is harming students in classrooms around the world, not to mention that professionals around the world are also being actively harmed by this, and it's completely unnecessary and completely preventable. So this musical will always get a hard side eye for me for that narrative alone, though there's other things in the show that definitely get side eyes for me. But anyway, thank you for letting me get that out of my system. Now we can talk disability. The musical's approach to the Phantom's disability is remarkably layered and inconsistent. The Phantom is portrayed in numerous ways: monster, criminal, genius, god, ghost, and his physical disability blurs regularly with his soul, which is where numerous characters locate the origin of his problems. His face and its famous mask covering are both feared and thrilled over, but with a reassuring dose of pity that allows the audience to feel comfortable leaning forward to catch a glimpse. How, in the supposedly more enlightened culture of the 1980s, and today as the show continues to thrive, can we justify what is, at base, a modern version of a circus freak show? And how does the musical shield the audience from feeling that it is? The musical's atmosphere, style, music, and lyrics create such a seductive sense of romance and tragic inevitability, cushioned with an extra layer of historical distance, that the discomfort we should feel is swept away by mega musical momentum. There's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with freak shows, because everything seems to start with freak shows. For a very brief overview, and I have a much more thorough video that I will link below and also in the card above, I'm also planning on making a theater-specific one that traces the specific historical overlap between the modern theater industry as we know it and the historical freak show, because that history is very much intertwined more than people think it is, but that video is yet to make it onto my schedule. Freak shows as a sociological concept, the idea of putting people who are different on display as some sort of human zoo or otherwise attraction, has always been around in one form or another, and they still exist. They've just morphed into different things that are more socially acceptable. We'll talk about that shortly. The freak show that you think of when you hear the word freak show is the kind created by P.T. Barnum in the mid-1800s. Barnum is known as the father of modern consumer culture because he was really good at doing the kind of advertising that has a teeny tiny asterisk at the bottom, and he was also really good at making merch and charging people for anything and everything. Also, most of his freak show performers were enslaved by him, so he didn't really have to pay them wages, but he did pay wages to some of them. His American Museum opened in New York City in 1842, and it boasted human oddities and other natural oddities and animal menagerie, performances, concerts, games, contests, beauty pageants, scientific lectures, you name it, Barnum offered it at this museum. He really played up the supposed scientific aspects of it to give him more credibility, and things written by physicians visiting the museums were often used effectively as advertisement, and is also where a lot of our records around freak show performers do come from. At its peak, Barnum's museum had about 15,000 visitors a day, and very quickly had a lot of copycats. I was curious to know, in repeating this fact this time around, what that actually looks like. So I did research on other museums and what their patronage is, and that is the equivalent of about 5 million patrons a year, which is the equivalent of what a current modern day American Museum of Natural History gets. So it's very comparable when the population was a lot smaller, which I think is very interesting. One thing I do want to say that isn't necessarily important to the context of this video, but is important regardless, is that freak shows are not a, oh, this was objectively bad situation. I know, bear with me for a second. They were the only place many disabled people could find community with other disabled people outside of institutions, particularly in the era of ugly laws, which made it illegal for visibly disabled people to be out in public. It was often steady income, or at least a steady place to sleep, and it gave them a lot more autonomy than many other disabled people had at the time. Also, many, if not most, people participating in freak shows were actually performers, people who would put on an act and play a character and play up their disability for the crowd, and thought it was kind of fun to mess with the non-disableds that came to gawk at them because they thought that they were silly. And freak pride was very much a real thing. And obviously, this is nuanced and complicated because is it really consent if you don't have any other options? And also, is liberation for one section of the community at the potential cost of the rest of it actually ethical? And the ethical discussion of freak shows is often compared to that of sex work and feminism as something that has always existed and probably isn't ever going to go away, and equality and freedom means everybody should have the option to do whatever they want, and instead of focusing on getting rid of something that's not going away, the focus should be on making it more ethical and safe for those who wish to partake. But also on the flip side, freak show ethics are also often compared to the history of blackface minstrelsy, which is something that has furthered a lot of stereotypes and damaging lies about black people, and it hasn't actually gone away now that I think about it. It's kind of morphed into something different no matter how hard we try to suppress it as well. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not an all good or an all bad situation, and it's also not something that we can go, wow, people back then were so silly, we know better now, because while freak shows may have changed their packaging, nothing has really changed that much. The other thing that I think is interesting is that when we discuss freak shows today, we typically talk about primarily physical difference, but at the time, there were lots of different things going on. Physical disability was obviously a huge part of it, but so was just being a different race, as was being atypically good at a certain skill. And at the time, freak and prodigy were effectively synonyms, though prodigy was seen as a slightly kinder word. So the fact that Eric was exceptionally good at certain skills, such as being a genius composer, would not necessarily mean that he could then afford to buy his way out of a freak show lens, because that would simply have just been a sort of bonus trait about him that would always still be the case. Now, we know that Eric effectively grew up in a freak show, one of the few scenes that is spoken rather than sung in the musical, which really shows the relative importance of this tidbit of Eric's backstory, given that everything else of import in the show is sung. It also means that this information is not on the soundtrack, so most listeners at home have no idea about this aspect of this character, and frankly, when you do see it live, it is spoken so quickly that it might as well not even be in the script to begin with. But we learned that this particular experience in the freak show involved being locked in a cage, so from that I think that we can assume that he was probably not in the realm of like stage performer or like integrated in the disabled community that existed within those traveling fairs, which if that had been the case, he probably would be a lot better adjusted today. But this got me thinking about what the Phantom's daily life might have looked like, which then brought up the question of whether his disability is simply a facial difference or if there's something else going on that might also impact his day-to-day, because often disabilities connect with other disabilities and comorbidities are a thing. And it's very common for texts discussing freak shows to note what a person's disabilities were advertised as, such as like dog boy, and then also specify what the modern equivalent might be, such as hypertrichosis, for example. But in all of my research, I never saw that appear in discussions of Eric, which somewhat makes sense. Very few people are talking about the original text, and also based on the film history, most people assume he's scarred from acid at some point later in life, despite it being in the text and in the text of the musical that he's born with a facial difference. So I wasn't super surprised to not find much conversation there, but that then, of course, created a quest. So you don't have a lot of information around what the Phantom looks like beyond Bouquet's commentary. He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeleton frame. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. You just see his two big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. His skin, which is stretched across his bones like a drumhead, is not white, but a nasty yellow. His nose is so little worth talking about that you can't see its side face, and the absence of that nose is a horrible thing to look at. All the hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks on his forehead and behind his ears. Eric himself says, "I am built up of death from head to foot." Someone else mentioned that he has a horrible hole of a nose, and we know that he's marketed in the freak show as the living corpse. And so now, while there is a chance that this description could be completely made up by Leroux out of nowhere to be fun and spooky and whatnot, I've generally found that in the hundreds of things that I've reviewed, people are really bad at creating fake disabilities, unless we're in a situation where it's like a fantasy world and the illness is that when you sneeze you go back in time. The majority of disabilities in media, whether named or not, do have a modern medical equivalent or a close adjacent medical equivalent. I think this is the case primarily for 2 reasons. The first, that being statistically there are so many differences that could exist within human bodies that any difference a person could imagine is probably a thing that exists, but also because humans are inherently inquisitive around and nervous about disability. It's something that weighs very heavily on our consciousness, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So when we're creating disability for media, it is usually based on something somebody has experience with to some degree and is still thinking about, whether that's their grandmother having memory loss, the non-speaking girl in their 5th grade class, or the person with a congenital difference they saw in a movie once. It's usually rooted in something that did exist. And given that LaRue wrote this book smack dab in the middle of the golden age of the freak show, and this character is described as having been a part of a freak show, I figured it's a very high statistical likelihood that despite having absolutely zero direct evidence to argue this at all whatsoever, Eric is likely based on a real person who existed. So then I started looking up historical European freak shows, trying to find a living corpse or somebody advertised along those lines, and I didn't find anything. Not that I'm surprised, because records were sketchy then, especially for European shows. Also, I definitely could have tried harder to look for this than I actually did, so there's also that. But what I did find was a single Reddit comment saying, with an air of "scholars agree upon this fact," that the Phantom had syphilis. And I was like, okay, great, who are scholars? So I sourced that back, and I ended up finding one of the funniest Medium articles I've ever read, titled "The Phantom of the Opera Has Syphilis, Explains Almost Everything." It's by Dr. Ariadne Schultz, a paleopathologist, which means she studies ancient medical issues based on bones and fossils. A lot of early and ancient disability studies relies on paleopathology, since written records of disability are so few and far between, so we look at bones to be like, oh yeah, that disability existed, etc. And she basically breaks down why it is most logical that Eric was born with congenital syphilis. For a brief background, in this era, syphilis was quite common, especially in cities, but also there was a lot of taboo around it because of its association with sex and promiscuity. People tried their best to hide it, it was generally talked about in a euphemistic way, and when it did pop up in media, it was usually a sign of impending doom or otherwise godly punishment for sin or moral failing. But even then, it was heavily coded, something everybody would have picked up without ever being super explicit about it. Kind of in the way that tuberculosis is everywhere in media, but half of the time it's not called that, and you're like, oh, I guess this could be tuberculosis. I didn't think about that. This is kind of that situation, but to a larger degree. It also seems like masks and false noses were sort of a thing to cover up various facial differences as caused by syphilis, but half of the sources that I read were debunking pieces of the other half of the sources, but then there were several extant prostheses from museums, either likely or deliberately to cover syphilitic facial differences that I found images of. So I'm not sure what the entire situation is there. These things definitely existed, but I don't know if they existed in the cultural consciousness enough to potentially be recognizable to the general population and understood as relating to syphilis, if that makes any sense. The syphilis-specific stigma may explain "this face which earned a mother's fear and loathing, a mask my first unfeeling scrap of clothing" line from the musical, and that him being a visual cue of a family's infection with syphilis would bring shame onto the family beyond the regular shame associated with general congenital disability that already existed back then. And that shame may be why his parents refused to care for him in the slightest or touch him because of fear of contagion as well. The original text version of the same line is, "When my own father never saw me, and when my mother, so as not to see me, made me a present of my first mask." But that brings us back to the Medium article, where she basically broke down different possible diagnoses based on what we know about the Phantom and settles quite convincingly on congenital syphilis rather than acquired syphilis, as we know his facial differences are a birth defect and a handful of other factors. Congenital syphilis can cause the skull and facial bones to form differently, sometimes in ways that may make a person appear as if they do not have a nose. It can also cause lesions, rashes, and sores, of which we know that he is covered. It can cause hair loss or inability to grow hair. It can cause impotence, which is a possible interpretation of the fate which condemns me to wallow in blood has also denied me the joys of the flesh line. Congenital syphilis can also cause deformation throughout the skeleton, loss of hearing, loss of vision, developmental delays, and neurological damage, which can result in partial paralysis and even seizures. Eric can clearly hear quite well, and he seems to be sighted, but we just don't know if he had developmental delays, if he sometimes seizes when alone or suffers from periodic paralysis. Given how much care he takes in dressing and planning, he probably is hiding a skeletal deformity and probably does have impairments that we just never get to see. The descriptions of him being extraordinarily thin and skeletal could be due to developmental difference. It could be due to feeding issues as a young child, which may have been caused by his facial differences, and he just never gained weight later. It could be that my dude lives underneath an opera house and never sees the sun and probably doesn't exercise that much and probably doesn't have a lot to eat, so it makes sense that he's going to be thin and have slightly off-colored and papery skin and eyes that look weird because they're not adjusted to what light looks like. And before finding this syphilis conversation, I asked some doctors I know for their opinions on a diagnostic profile for Eric based on the information that we have, and they suggested malnutrition and severe vitamin D deficiency because of his lifestyle, which I think could also add into this. Dr. Schultz also talks about how we see fluctuating energy from the Phantom, which would make sense with having a disease that causes the occasional flare-up and is also definitely progressing to some degree. And we know that stress makes chronic chronic illnesses worse, and the transition of his opera house into the hands of new people clearly caused a lot of stress for him, so we would see accelerated symptoms. She specifically notes how in between Act 1 and Act 2, the Phantom disappears for several months, supposedly to write his opera, but with other context clues, it seems like his opera was pretty much done by the time he brought Christine to his lair the first time, and in Act 2, he's a lot less energetic with everything that he does. He stays put when he can, he delivers his threats and orders from afar, he doesn't appear in person when he can avoid it, and when he does appear, he usually keeps his distance and wears costumes or a cloak that entirely cover and obscure every inch of his body, including his scalp and face. To me, this sounds like a man who had a flare-up, is not fully recovered, and is trying to hide what he perceives as a weakness. The story itself is also structured in a way that, depending on the adaptation, he either dies at the end or it's implied that he probably dies at the end, which would also make sense from an illness progression standpoint. Him hitting the point of no return could be interpreted as him knowing that he is imminently dying and trying the last thing that he possibly can to get the girl before he kicks the bucket in a way that is... I mean, it was never really super rational because he was kind of killing people from the get-go, but definitely hits a point of desperation we haven't seen from the Phantom before, which sort of segues into the madness discussion that I'm going to keep brief because this is more speculation than I normally like to do in conversations around madness, but congenital syphilis is associated with developmental delays and neurological damage. Also, as syphilis progresses, it generally kind of eats away at your brain. It's still somewhat unclear to me whether congenital would progress in a way that is similar to that of acquired syphilis, and I wasn't able to find clear answers on that, so I don't know. But the primary reason that I'm a bit hesitant to bring this piece into the picture is because I'm very used to media, particularly true crime media, going, oh, they had a brain difference, and therefore that's why they did X, Y, and Z horrific thing, despite research generally showing that people with mental disabilities are no more violent than the general population, if not actively less than. But that being said, if syphilis is eating your frontal lobe, that is going to impact a person's emotional regulation and impulse control, and regardless of his mental status, he was not ever in his life shown love or compassion. That's also going to seriously mess up a person and potentially make them want to get revenge. And I think there is an instinct to be like, oh yeah, well the Phantom's crazy, he's a serial killer, that makes me a bit uneasy linguistically, and I talked about this in Sweeney Todd as well, so I'm gonna just play that clip. Now, there's something to be said about the fact that we see villains or people doing bad things as inherently mentally ill to justify to ourselves that there is a clean line between people who do good things and people who do bad things, and that actually we'd be able to figure out who they are and save ourselves before anything bad happens to us. This is a human survival mechanism, it makes sense, but it's also a problematic one in regards to how it leads us to treat disabled people and use disability words. And it also puts us in more danger because if you think that everybody's inherently bad or good and you're looking for outside things on like, oh, they must be a bad person and they must be a good person, you often end up with the wrong answers. And also everybody is complicated and in the gray areas, and most everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing. Like I say this time and time again, the majority of abusers do not mean to abuse people. It's just how they think human interaction is supposed to work or how they can get what they want. And in this case, the ending of the show being an acknowledgement that a Sweeney Todd could be anywhere, you could be sitting next to him and not realize it, kind of reflects this ideology, but just because it's in the show does not mean that people necessarily internalize it or internalize it as the message of the show. Now the situation is obviously a little bit different here, where I'd argue that we do have some solid evidence that there actually may be some sort of neurological situation going on with Eric, but I think there is a world where we can hold the nuance of all of those pieces at the same time and say, yeah, he may be neurodivergent, but that isn't the reason that he's a murderer. Or if it's involved at all, it's not the only factor at play by far, and any person, regardless of neurotype, who is treated like Eric was, may end up in the same situation. Also, my guy has zero social interaction, and he sleeps in a coffin and he lives in the dark. I think that that is going to have more impact on his mental state than any cognitive difference that he was born with would on its own. Which starts to dip into the wishy-washiness of diagnostic criteria and how things could be situational or could be internal, but are usually a combination of that, and at what point does that or does that not warrant diagnosis and further pathologization. And for me, I feel like in this case particularly, it doesn't, particularly given the sketchy history around violence and mental health diagnostics in regards to people who like to harm and or kill people, and I don't think that added language would actually aid in our understanding of this character and may actively harm it. But I do want to go back to the freak show idea for a moment, particularly the fact that while Barnum-style freak shows don't really exist anymore, the sociological concept has not gone away. We generally find that when one kind of human display becomes socially frowned upon, it just morphs into a different kind of human display. Some very clear modern day examples would be Ripley's Believe It or Not, the Guinness Book of World Records, reality TV shows that focus on people with physical or mental differences in a somewhat sensationalized way, and medical documentaries. Barnum-style freak shows started to fall out of favor by the 1930s with increased medicalization of disability and pity towards disabled people that created more social uncomfortability around watching disabled performers, which is a legacy that we still haven't actually contended with, and is a huge reason disabled representation on stage makes people so viscerally uncomfortable in comparison to seeing it on film or in photos, but that's neither here nor there. This is when we start to see freak shows branch off into other things that fulfill the same function of like human thrill and, well, I might not be normal, but at least I'm more normal than them, that kind of feeling. And one of these huge branches off was horror films. Now, horror as a genre deliberately uses the idea that the boundary between human and non-human, between disabled and non-disabled, is a very unstable one that could change at any given moment. Humans are wired to feel like sane equals safe and different equals unknown and therefore potentially unsafe, and so somebody trying to make something scary is going to create something that is both same and different enough to really walk that line to create a level of fear, thrill, and general unease. And it usually makes use of disability to do so, whether that's the disabled villain or the person that's just a little uncomfortable to look at, or the poor disabled person who can't run from the monster. But usually it's the disabled monster. The boundary between the dominant and the marginal is unstable, and the horror genre reveals that this instability can be used as a device to incite fear. Anxiety about disability typically reduces characters in the horror genre to objects of pity, spectacle, or rage, oftentimes returning to old cultural norms that link disabled bodies with sin and depravity. And we very much see these things with the Phantom. Is he some sort of murderous ghost, or is he a person? It links his outward appearance as visually different to the fact that he doesn't mind committing murder to make a point, as if to say, well, he's mentally broken, and you can tell that's the case because he's physically broken too. We especially see this in the Hays Code era films, where he is disfigured by acid after he starts to turn evil to sort of symbolize this connection. It's also used to fuel the obsessive Avenger trope, which is described by scholar Martin Norden as an egomaniacal sort, almost always an adult male who does not rest until he has had his revenge on those he holds responsible for his disablement and or violating his moral code in some other way. A trope that relies on a non-disabled assumption that disabled people are bitter and angry about the fact that they are disabled and may want to harm the person or the thing that caused them to be that way, fueled by some sort of jealousy of non-disableds. Phantom is also very narratively confused as to whether Eric is meant to be some object of pity or some sort of obsessed Avenger, whether he has lots of autonomy or no autonomy at all. You're both meant to feel bad for him for his situation and also fear him because he's out for blood. The Phantom is simultaneously superhuman, an angel, a god, a ghost, a genius, and subhuman, a monster, a remorseless killer, a half-dead creature. He is virtually never portrayed as a maladjusted human who happens to have a physical disability. And part of this is because while he is a central character of the story, he never really gets his I want moment. We never really get the chance to know him as a human, to see him as defined by him rather than how everybody else around him describes him and reacts to him. This is a huge reason that, other than vocals, each Phantom effectively feels identical, because the actor has zero wiggle room to really do anything with the character because he's always and almost exclusively defined by everybody else around him. What I will say is that while this is sort of the case in the book, it's structured quite differently. We see him exclusively through the lens of the people he has impacted with his behavior, and we don't learn anything concrete about him until we get to his backstory in the final pages, which builds up one particular narrative of him in your head without ever seeing or interacting with him, which is then destabilized when you're given more information at the end. And so you're left thinking about how maybe at the end of the day, he was just a person who had been through rough times and handled it really poorly. And in the musical, it tries to balance both narratives at the same time throughout the piece, many of those things coming directly from the Phantom himself, in an arguably unsuccessful way that ends up creating a sort of tonal whiplash with his character. Bringing the Hunchback comparison back for a moment, sorry, we're gonna just keep making that comparison, but that's a narrative where a very similar story is told, one that somewhat questions who is the monster and who is the man, and in some sense, how do people become evil? And it has a lot of the same emotional beats and a lot of the same narrative directions, and I don't think that that's an accident. The Victorian era and just after that had a lot of very specific fears around bodily difference. Not that that's super different today, like humans are going to human and we don't actually change that much, but it was a very specific narrative device that came up very frequently in this era, in this particular monster or man narrative style that we don't see as much now. But I also guarantee you that Leroux, as a French journalist, had hands down read Hunchback before he wrote the story and was undeniably inspired by it to some degree. But that story did a somewhat similar thing where we learn a lot about how other people view Quasimodo before we learn about what his life looks like, in a way that sort of makes you complicit in the initial viewing of this character as a monster, which then you are later forced to reckon with to some degree as you learn more about the character and realize your initial instinct may have been somewhat prejudiced. In the Disney adaptation, they chose to center Quasimodo, making it instead more or less from his perspective, which serves a different narrative purpose, but they did it in such a way that still generally gets the same idea across and sort of balanced both the who he is and who people tell him he is in a way that tonal shifts quite well. So really what I'm saying is the tonal weirdness is a uniquely Weber issue, because Eric can be both tragic and horrible at the same time. People hold a lot of nuance, but the musical goes to such extremes on both ends and constantly switches back and forth between those two extremes while glorifying really weird portions of each extreme in a way that I think kind of shoots itself in the foot, because it makes the Phantom himself expanded far beyond human personhood. which would almost work if the rest of the characters were just as expanded and campy and really played into the operatic archetypes that were clearly somewhat conceptually considered in the writing of this piece. But since he's the only one that's like that, it becomes a bit of a reflection on disabled personhood a la an old horror film, rather than a nuanced critique of how we treat outsiders, which is what it claims itself to be. It's the difference between a true crime documentary that exists as an actual documentary and tells you facts about things that happened, and the way that Netflix tried to market Jeffrey Dahmer. And in doing so, it plays into this weird feedback loop that justifies alienating people who are different. Somebody who's treated like the other because they are different, that person then becomes frustrated with society because it treated them that way, and then we point at their behavior and we go, see? That's why we cast them out before. We were right in doing that. We knew what they were going to become. We just end up rationalizing our own prejudice because really we're not discriminating. We're just finding the dangerous ones before they get dangerous. And it's not hard for the specific narrative to continue that feedback loop because the musical's already telling you that the disabled life equates to being alone and alienated and unlovable. The story tells us that the most love a disabled person will ever get is a pity kiss. And this is also not just from the narrative. We get it straight from the Phantom himself in what I know is internalized ableism, but what an audience might perceive as, oh, disabled people hate themselves for being disabled and are so very miserable and lonely all the time. Which maybe, I don't know, isn't the best thing. On the topic of internalized ableism though, I think there's an interesting interpretation where he became so good at being a composer and an architect and an assassin because he felt like he was a burden and he needed to be exceptionally good at many things to make up for that fact. But that's beside the point because why are we gonna have that kind of level of depth in the show? Along the lines of internalized ableism is a real thing, but when you demonstrate that in media, you have to be really careful with it. We also have the fact that if you really start to look for it, in the show, most of the anxiety toward the Phantom is because he's unpredictable and, again, cannot state this enough, is a serial killer, but only if you're not paying attention to it. Otherwise, you will process it as people fear him primarily because he has a facial difference, which also isn't great. The last narrative device that I want to bring up is the love triangle, which I still don't think should exist. Arguably, it doesn't actually exist because in all versions other than Weber's, and also maybe the 1943 version where the Raouls are gay, Raoul's the only option for Christine, and he somewhat exists for that precise purpose. We're all kind of used to Beauty and the Beast stories, and they've been around for a long time. Leroux would have read them as well. And those either end with the princess kissing the beast and him turning into a beautiful prince, or with the beast sacrificing himself to a life of tragic heartbreak so she can choose the normal relationship with a conventionally attractive, able-bodied guy. These men are meant to be reflections of each other. They're two sides of the same normative coin. And in Phantom, much like in Hunchback, it ends in the disabled character sacrificing themselves, something that is sad but seen as the right choice to make, one that would be worth it because he's disabled. Who would ever love him as he is? Which is a usage of the cure or kill trope where, much like the bury or gaze trope, don't worry, you don't have to stress about what happens to the disabled character after the story ends because they either die or they get cured. And again, in this version, he doesn't explicitly die, but he disappears and the general assumption is that he died of a broken heart or whatever. And I do think the fact that this is the general audience assumption says something about how people are viewing this show through the lens of those tropes. And obviously, again, this is complicated by the fact that he is a serial killer, but the harmful use of tropes does not magically disappear when you add in a single extra narrative piece. That doesn't suddenly justify it. But that brings us, of course, to the final section of these videos, which is the now what section. And honestly, I don't have a lot to say here other than like the usual, let's cast disabled people in disabled roles, that's really cool. But even that wouldn't make a huge narrative difference because the script is so incredibly limiting for this role in a way that doesn't give really any space for expanding him as a character narratively or emotionally. And I'm happy to be proven wrong. Like maybe this mythical immersive Phantom's gonna turn out to be a thing and I can go see it and I'll change my ideas on this and maybe I'll think something different. Like, maybe I've just never seen a different staging of it and therefore I can't imagine it, but I do feel like that probably isn't the case. My other thing about ethical staging is that normally my suggestions are geared towards regional theaters and high schools, and in this case it appears that Phantom, as of 2011, is only open for licensing for high schoolers. I don't think this is a show that should be done by high schools at all, ever. In the same way that I still feel weird about my high school doing Rent and my friend's high school doing Chicago, there are some shows that maybe with the knowledge that, oh, the high school's doing the show, let me bring my elementary and middle schoolers to it, shouldn't be happening at certain age groups. Also, high schoolers are still children. Also, like the whole trauma-informed education thing that we talked about earlier. But the show is not going away. I think it's starting to fall out of favor because it's not aging super well. It's no longer actively running on Broadway. And also I think that everything with Bad Cinderella turned a lot of cultural discussion around Andrew Lloyd Webber more toward the negative than it was previously. But I also feel like most of the cultural damage of the show has already been done because of how entrenched it is in theater history. And the best way to sort of unpack that and undo that harm is not to stage the show differently, but to have conversations like this one and talk about the show differently through a new lens. One thing I was most interested in going into this was wondering what the disabled community might have to say about this show. And I didn't find a ton of conversation outside of the academic discussions that I read, but I did find a vlog titled Freewheelin' by Karen Willison, which had a page titled Unmasking My Past as an OG Phantom Phantom of the Opera fan, where she talked about how she found Phantom growing up and what it meant to her as a disabled person to see this outcast character that she could relate to and connect to, and how that fundamentally changed her life, but also how over time she sort of outgrew the show. Theater has become more inclusive, and I can see myself in people I care about in characters such as Elphaba in Wicked and Allison in Fun Home. These characters don't hide away in a cellar, they fight for their voices to be heard. Which I feel like sort of explains a lot of why a lot of people feel less inclined toward this show now. It was the first of its kind to so many degrees, it was so many people's gateway show to theater, but we also have since seen more things and learned more things, and so what felt fresh and new and exciting in the 80s doesn't feel as much that way today, particularly as some of the romance stuff continues to age exponentially poorly. It's kind of like how Atypical meant a lot to me as autistic representation until we started getting Everything's Gonna Be Okay and Heartbreak High and A Kind of Spark. And I realized that actually Atypical expanded my horizons in one direction, but mostly played into traditional socio-cultural standards and stereotypes in many others. And it will always have a place in my heart because it helped me understand myself, but I also definitely have many much better recommendations that have the same effect in a much less harmful way. And when you see yourself in something for the first time, that's important, that sticks with you. But also as time goes on and you learn more, you start to think more critically about that stepping stone piece that got you to where you are today. And I think that many people will use that nostalgia as a sort of get out of jail free card for some really harmful things, as if you can't still love a thing that you heavily critique, and that the fact that you can critique things now means that you have learned things and bettered yourself as a person, which I've just never quite understood. And obviously that blog does not represent the entirety of the disabled community, but I do feel like that sentiment sort of carried through a lot of the other more academic critiques of the show that I read in regards to how disability is portrayed. And I thought it very interesting and important way to phrase a feeling toward this piece. It's not that it's bad, it's that we know better now and we can do better now and we expect better now. And we thank the stepping stone for getting us here, but maybe we don't need that stepping stone anymore. But anyway, I'm gonna leave this one on that note. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments if you have any, and as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, remember to never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.